What started as a standard traffic stop involving a convicted sex offender turned into something far more disturbing when investigators discovered a cell phone loaded with images of child exploitation. Hidden among those files, authorities claim they uncovered footage showing 26-year-old Cassie Snay engaged in sexual activity with a canine. The probable cause documents indicate she admitted everything to law enforcement, acknowledging that she recorded the footage and participated in these actions. However, following that admission, Snay has come forward with an unusual explanation for what happened. We're covering this case on Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Alright everyone, before we dive in, let me tell you about something perfect if you're shopping for gifts. Check out the Chef IQ Sense Smart Meat Thermometer. This thing is a game changer for worry-free, perfectly cooked meals every single time. Whether you're already skilled in the kitchen or you're like me just figuring things out and trying not to burn dinner, this smart device ensures you get flawless results without fail. No more second-guessing, no more dried-out disasters. Here's how it works. You stick in the probe, they look like this, pick your protein, choose how you're cooking it, and set your desired level of doneness. After that, you're good to go. The app will ping you when it's time to turn it, take it off the heat, or let it rest. Foolproof cooking every single time. Whether it's Thanksgiving turkey, a standing rib roast, chicken wings, slow-cooked brisket, or fresh fish, this works with any cooking method: baking, grilling, smoking, air frying, you name it. Seriously, you can't screw this up. It's the kind of present that takes all the anxiety out of meal prep and actually makes it enjoyable. Use my promo code OTC to get 30% off everything at chefiq.com. An extensive investigation into child exploitation material in Indiana has brought investigators face-to-face with another deeply unsettling finding. Alleged video footage depicting a woman performing acts of bestiality with a household pet. 26-year-old Cassie Snay is now facing serious felony accusations related to bestiality, as detailed in a probable cause document that Law and Crime has reviewed. These disturbing claims surfaced while detectives were examining the mobile device of a convicted perpetrator of child abuse, where they were sifting through an astounding 69,000 photographs and 11,000 video files containing child sexual exploitation content. According to their findings, among all that material was video showing Snay performing explicit sexual behavior with a black and tan dog. Yet following her arrest, Snay hasn't simply denied the accusations. Instead, she's presented an explanation that's just as strange as the alleged offense. We've gone through the legal filings and her public statements, and what's contained in those documents is both graphic and deeply troubling. I need to give you that heads up. This isn't the type of criminal matter we typically examine on this show. Our story begins last December with an individual named Trey Metler. Based on the probable cause paperwork, Metler is someone who's required to register as a sex offender, more specifically labeled as a sexually violent predator stemming from a conviction in 2014 for molesting a child. That 2014 case, however, marked just the start of an extensive criminal history. Available court records show a repeated pattern where Metler neglected to fulfill his obligations under sex offender registration laws. We dug into those records ourselves. The documents show he was found guilty of registration violations in 2022, then again in 2023, and yet another time in early 2025. The affidavit explains that back in December 2024, law enforcement in Wells County, Indiana launched an inquiry after Metler supposedly didn't report a change in where he was living, which constitutes a criminal offense for individuals on such a registry. Come January of this year, court documents state that a detective conducted a traffic stop on Metler, placed him under arrest for the registration failure, and obtained judicial authorization to examine his vehicle. During that search, officers report finding controlled substances, drug-related items, and a pair of mobile phones, including an iPhone 14 with a red protective case. That traffic stop resulted in additional serious charges being filed against Metler. The court paperwork indicates he faced immediate charges beyond just the registration violation, including having methamphetamine in his possession, possessing illegal narcotics, and perhaps most significant for what investigators would later uncover, being in possession of child pornography. The affidavit describes the phone as essentially a repository of child sexual abuse imagery, holding what law enforcement characterizes as 69,000 still images along with 11,000 video recordings of what's known as CSAM. These materials were apparently accessed via platforms including Telegram, Snapchat, and Kik. Yet while combing through that enormous and horrifying collection, investigators report they kept encountering photographs and footage of someone they were able to identify: 26-year-old Cassie Snay. Court documents note that Snay and Metler maintained an inconsistent romantic involvement with each other. Authorities claim they discovered content that seemed to place Snay inside her residence in Fort Wayne, Indiana. One particular video, based on what the investigating detective swore to in official statements, forms the basis for why Cassie Snay now sits behind bars in an Allen County detention facility facing 2 separate counts of bestiality. According to what's laid out in the affidavit, once investigators positively identified multiple images and videos featuring Cassie Snay on that iPhone, the detective conducting the investigation examined them thoroughly. He subsequently compiled an extensive catalog of what was found, which serves as the foundation for the 2 bestiality charges she's facing. The affidavit references each piece of evidence by its forensic identification tag. Though the descriptions contained in these documents are intensely graphic in nature, they paint a picture of repeated sexual conduct involving Snay and a family pet. The paperwork states the initial occurrence was captured on video on January 17, 2024, describing footage where Snay performs a sexual act with a black and tan-colored dog. The document, however, doesn't stop there. It details numerous other instances. The affidavit claims there exists a sequence of more videos and still photographs with metadata showing they were made anywhere from January all the way through October of 2024. Based on what the affidavit lays out, these digital files show Snay participating in multiple forms of sexual conduct with this same animal, the black and tan canine she would eventually name to authorities. What's described encompasses the dog being made to perform sexual behaviors on her performing sexual behaviors on the animal, and explicit conduct taking place during video communications. This really isn't an easy subject matter to discuss. The document also mentions that GPS location information embedded in one particular file indicates an alleged incident occurred at a Motel 6 location. Perhaps most importantly, the affidavit indicates that on September 19, 2025, the investigating detective sat down with Cassie Snay for a recorded interview after reading her Miranda rights. I'm going to quote directly from what appears at the conclusion of the affidavit here. It states, "During the interview, Snay admitted to committing these crimes, including making and sending these photos and videos to Mettler via cell phone. Snay admitted her canine claws were the dogs in all of the videos and photos, but Coda is the only dog she engaged in sexual behavior with." The document goes on to note that she acknowledged these acts happened in Allen County, either at the home where her mother lives or at a Motel 6. So here's how the affidavit builds its case. An investigation into a sex offender leads to discovering a phone that contains an absolutely massive archive of child sexual exploitation material. Buried within that archive, detectives claim they located a series of graphic videos and photographs showing Snay in sexual situations with a dog. And finally, according to the document, she confessed to all of it when questioned by police. This convergence of electronic evidence paired with what's presented as a confession establishes the legal justification for taking her into custody. But this is far from the end of the story. Following that recorded conversation with law enforcement, Snay started providing a completely different account of the videos in question. She's made public statements asserting that what appears in those videos isn't what it looks like. In social media posts that Law and Crime has examined, Snay has advanced an unusual defense strategy, placing all responsibility on Trey Mettler and asserting she was forced into these acts through physical violence. In one back and forth within a Facebook comments area, she posts, and I'm quoting here, "I'd love to explain and show the world he beat me for this." When someone poses the direct question, "Are you saying he was forcing you to do that?" she answers with, quote, Yes, I've been gathering so much proof. I'm so sorry to everyone I ever let him hurt me into this, but I'll prove my way. I promise," end quote. In a separate comment, she doubles down on the assertion of being forced, typing out, quote, "Forced to. I got beat and so much more." That defense, however, has encountered swift and sharp doubt, even from people online. One individual fired back at her assertion saying, quote, "You could have quite literally got him arrested for domestic violence and went to a victim's advocate if you had proof of anything. Nobody forced you to stay. Nobody forced you to mess with animals." Formal charges were filed against Snay on December 9 for 2 separate counts of bestiality, with each one categorized as a Level 6 felony under Indiana law. Based on the court docket that's accessible to the public, she was taken into custody on a warrant, appeared before a judge for the first time in Allen Superior Court on December 15, and the court determined there was sufficient probable cause to move forward with prosecuting the case. Records from that court appearance show that a public defender was assigned to handle her legal representation, and she was let go from jail under certain conditions and monitoring requirements while her case works its way through the system. Now let's examine what all of this actually means from a legal standpoint and why situations like this carry more weight than some people might initially realize. When we're discussing charges related to bestiality, we're looking at an offense that numerous states still have difficulty properly addressing within their criminal codes. Indiana places it in the category of a level 6 felony, which on the surface might not seem particularly severe, but it actually comes with the possibility of incarceration ranging from 6 months up to 2.5 years, in addition to potential financial penalties reaching as high as $10,000. What really jumps out in this particular case, though, is how it intersects with child sexual exploitation material. Academic research has repeatedly demonstrated a troubling correlation between cruelty toward animals and additional categories of violent behavior, especially offenses targeting children. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has acknowledged animal cruelty as an offense against the broader community, which is why they began documenting it as its own category in their crime data starting in 2016. What's the reasoning behind that decision? Studies have demonstrated that individuals who engage in animal abuse show significantly elevated likelihood of perpetrating violent criminal acts against human beings. We're not discussing some minor statistical relationship here. Various research projects have determined that somewhere in the range of 70 to 80% of individuals taken into custody for abusing animals have criminal records that include other violent offenses as well. Consider what detectives uncovered during this investigation. They were examining Trey Metler's phone precisely because he's a person with a conviction for molesting children and he neglected to properly register as a sex offender. Within that device, they discovered 69,000 photographic images alongside 11,000 video recordings depicting child sexual exploitation. That's not merely a handful of files, we're talking about a truly enormous collection representing innumerable young victims. Mixed in among all that horrifying content, they located videos purportedly showing Cassie Snay engaging in bestiality with her pet dog. The reality that these two categories of abuse coexist on the same electronic device, allegedly being shared between these two people, reflects a behavioral pattern that both law enforcement professionals and psychological researchers have been documenting for many years now. What makes this situation especially disturbing is looking at the timeline involved. Based on what the affidavit states, the photographs and videos featuring Snay were created over a span running from January 2024 all the way through October 2024. We're looking at 10 full months of purported continuous abuse. This wasn't some isolated occurrence. The legal documents outline multiple separate acts occurring at multiple different locations, including the residence where her mother lives and at a Motel 6. The deliberate planning and the fact that these acts repeated themselves demonstrates a behavioral pattern rather than simply an error in judgment or a single mistake. Then we need to talk about the explanation she's now offering. After giving what started as a confession to law enforcement in that recorded interview where she'd been read her rights, Snay went to social media platforms making assertions that she was compelled to engage in these behaviors by Trey Metler. Her claim is that he physically assaulted her, that she was coerced through violent threats. Now, domestic violence is absolutely a real phenomenon, and coercive control represents a serious problem that keeps many victims trapped in horrible circumstances. Here's where her explanation starts falling apart when you look at it closely though. If the story is that she was being compelled to perform these actions under the threat of being physically harmed, why would she continue participating in producing this content across a 10-month time frame? What? When you look at the timeline, it doesn't line up with what she's claiming. Metler got arrested in January of 2025, yet based on what the affidavit lays out, videos featuring Snay kept being produced all the way through October of 2024. That means some of these alleged acts took place before he was even in police custody. She had multiple opportunities to report any abuse she was supposedly experiencing. She could have sought help from a domestic violence shelter, reached out to police, contacted victim advocacy organizations. Yet according to what the evidence shows, she allegedly kept producing this material and transmitting it to him. People responding online were fast to identify the problems with her version of events, and to be honest, their skepticism isn't unfounded. One person commented, "You could have quite literally got him arrested for domestic violence and went to a victim's advocate if you had proof of anything. Nobody forced you to stay. Nobody forced you to mess with animals." It's a blunt response, certainly, but it addresses the fundamental problem here. Even if we were to accept her claim of being in an abusive relationship, and that's quite a stretch considering what the evidence indicates, that still doesn't justify or account for engaging in acts of bestiality and recording them. We need to discuss the animal that fell victim in this case, because that aspect frequently gets overlooked when people talk about these types of crimes. The affidavit states that Snay told police she owned 2 dogs, one she identified as Claus and another named Coda. She informed law enforcement that Coda was the animal she performed sexual acts with. This dog, this living being that relies entirely on human beings for protection and care, was allegedly subjected to ongoing sexual abuse spanning 10 months. Dogs lack the capacity to consent to anything. They can't comprehend what's being done to them. They're utterly defenseless against whatever actions their owners choose to take. When animal abuse cases go through the legal system, the animals involved are generally taken into custody and kept as evidence while court proceedings continue. They wind up in shelter facilities, sometimes remaining there for months or potentially years, waiting while the legal machinery grinds forward. While being in a shelter certainly beats living in an abusive environment, it's far from an ideal situation. These animals have experienced trauma, and they require specialized attention and care, and eventually, with any luck, placement with a loving permanent family where they can begin healing and spend their remaining years living in safety and peace. What's going to happen with Coda and Claus at this point? We don't have clarity on that yet since the legal case is still working its way through the courts. Typically though, after a case reaches its conclusion and the person accused is either found guilty or found not guilty, the animals can be placed up for adoption. In cases that get significant public attention like this one, there's usually plenty of people ready and willing to provide a safe home. People hear these stories and feel heartbroken for the innocent animals caught up in them, and they want to be part of the solution. So there's reason to hope these dogs will ultimately land somewhere safe where they're loved and cared for properly. This brings us to a more significant question though: how do we stop situations like this from occurring in the first place? The overlap between child sexual exploitation material and animal abuse isn't some random coincidence. Research demonstrates that people who perpetrate one form of abuse frequently engage in other types as well. There's what researchers call the violence graduation hypothesis. Essentially the concept that abusers commonly begin with animals since they're accessible targets who can't report what's being done to them, and then progress to victimizing human beings. Law enforcement organizations are improving their ability to identify these behavioral patterns. When they discover evidence of animal abuse while investigating other criminal matters, they're treating it with appropriate seriousness. When they're looking into animal abuse situations, they're examining whether there are indicators of other forms of violence present in the household. This kind of cross-training and heightened awareness is critically important because identifying and stopping abusers at early stages, before their behavior escalates further, can genuinely save lives, both human lives and animal lives. How the legal system handles animal abuse has undergone substantial transformation over recent decades. There was a time when animal cruelty barely qualified as a misdemeanor in most jurisdictions, assuming it got prosecuted at all. Animals were regarded strictly through the lens of property law, and damaging someone's property simply wasn't viewed as a particularly serious criminal matter. Advocacy groups have pushed hard to reform those laws though, and at this point every single state has provisions making animal cruelty a felony offense. Some states have gone so far as to establish dedicated registries for animal abusers, functioning similarly to sex offender registries, with the goal of preventing these individuals from owning animals going forward. Indiana's classification of bestiality as a Level 6 felony actually came about fairly recently. The state modernized its animal cruelty statutes within the past several years to explicitly address bestiality and strengthen the associated penalties. Level 6 represents the least severe felony category within Indiana's legal framework, but it still carries serious consequences. What it means is that Cassie Snay, should she be convicted, faces the prospect of time behind bars, supervised probation, monetary fines, and a criminal record that follows her permanently. She could be prohibited from having animals as pets in the future. Perhaps equally significant, her case becomes part of the public record, searchable by anyone, permanently labeling her as someone who committed these particular acts. The question that looms over these cases though is whether she'll actually experience those consequences. That's always the uncertainty. Historically, cases involving animal abuse have seen lower rates of conviction compared to other categories of violent crime. Why does that happen? Part of it comes down to prosecutors being overwhelmed with caseloads and making the decision to focus their resources on cases with human victims. Part of it stems from juries sometimes failing to regard animal abuse with appropriate gravity. And part of it relates to the challenges involved in establishing the required legal elements of these offenses. In this particular case though, the prosecution appears to have substantial evidence to work with. They've got videos and photographs purportedly depicting Snay engaged in these acts. They've got GPS metadata establishing her presence at particular locations. They've got her own admission captured in a recorded police interview. And they've got her statements acknowledging that Coda belonged to her and that she participated in sexual activity with that dog. That's about as strong a foundation for a case as prosecutors could hope to build. Her claim of having been coerced is going to face serious challenges. To successfully present a defense based on duress or coercion, she'd need to demonstrate she was facing an immediate threat of severe physical injury or death, that no reasonable avenue of escape was available to her, and that she didn't recklessly put herself into that situation through her own actions. Given how long these alleged acts continued and the fact they occurred across multiple locations, including her mother's residence, meeting that legal threshold is going to prove extremely difficult. The prosecution could very well counter that even assuming there was some element of coercion involved, and aside from her own unsubstantiated social media posts, there's zero evidence supporting that she still possessed free will and options. She could have filed a report about Mettler being abusive. She could have declined to produce the videos. She could have reached out for assistance. Instead, if the evidence is accurate, she actively participated in producing and distributing this content. One element of this case that's particularly notable is how social media and digital technology factor in. The videos were supposedly transmitted via mobile phone, most likely using applications like Snapchat that market themselves on the promise of content that vanishes after being viewed. Here's the reality about digital evidence, though. It almost never truly disappears. Even after files get deleted, even when apps make guarantees that content will self-destruct, forensic specialists possess the technical capabilities to retrieve that data. In this instance, everything was sitting right there on Mettler's device when law enforcement executed their search. This reflects a broader pattern we're observing across criminal cases in general. Technology that was developed to simplify our lives and keep us connected is simultaneously creating permanent documentation of criminal conduct. People record themselves breaking the law and upload it to the internet. They distribute illegal content through messaging platforms. They create their own evidence trail of unlawful activities because they either don't fully grasp or don't truly believe that this documentation can eventually be used against them. Looking at Snay's situation, if these allegations hold up, she produced video documentation of herself committing serious felony offenses and then transmitted that evidence to someone who's a convicted sex offender, whose phone stood a high likelihood of being searched by authorities given his legal status and his established pattern of violating registration requirements. It's difficult to conceive of a more foolish choice from a legal defense perspective. Which brings us back around to the fundamental question of motivation. What would drive someone to do something like this? What would possess someone to abuse an animal in this manner? What would make someone document it and share that documentation? These are uncomfortable questions to wrestle with, and the explanations are complicated and multifaceted. Some individuals who engage in bestiality have what psychologists term paraphilias, sexual attractions that fall outside normal parameters and cause harm. Some experienced abuse themselves during childhood and developed severely warped understandings of appropriate relationships and personal boundaries. Some fall under the influence of partners who manipulate them into participating in criminal activities. Regardless of what psychological factors might be at play, though, the legal reality remains crystal clear. These behaviors constitute crimes. They inflict harm on innocent creatures who have no means of protecting themselves. They frequently connect to other manifestations of violence and abuse. And they demand serious attention from law enforcement agencies, prosecuting attorneys, and the judicial system. As this case continues moving through the legal process, several different outcomes remain possible. Snay might accept a plea bargain, acknowledging guilt to lesser charges in return for reduced sentencing. She might proceed to trial and end up convicted on every count, resulting in maximum penalties. She might be acquitted if a jury doesn't find the prosecution's evidence convincing or accepts her explanation of having been coerced. Or the case might get thrown out if significant problems emerge regarding how evidence was gathered or processed. Looking at the evidence that's been disclosed publicly so far, a conviction appears probable. That said, we've witnessed unexpected verdicts in courtrooms before, and nothing's guaranteed until either a jury or a judge renders a final judgment. What we can say definitively is that this case has brought attention to issues that far too many people would rather ignore: the reality that animals are sexually abused, the connections between different categories of violent behavior, and how vulnerable animals are within our society. For the dogs caught up in this case, for Coda and Claus, the hope is they'll eventually find peace and security. For the young victims whose images were discovered on Mettler's phone, the hope is law enforcement can determine their identities and ensure they receive the assistance and justice they're entitled to. For Cassie Snay, assuming she's found guilty, The hope is she faces suitable consequences and loses any future opportunity to harm additional animals. And for everyone following this case as it unfolds, it serves as a reminder that these crimes are real, that they carry significance, and that we all need to remain watchful in safeguarding the most vulnerable members of our communities, whether they're children or animals who lack the ability to advocate for themselves. Thanks for watching. If you found this coverage valuable, please hit that like button and share it with others who should see this. Don't forget to subscribe. We bring you the most significant legal cases and criminal investigations with expert analysis and breaking developments. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on this case.